So welcome once again to this session. My name is Teresa and I am a human being. I like to say that a lot because when they finish reading the bio, it feels like the person is an alien. It feels like um it's not something most people can relate. It just feels like wow, 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 so much expectation built. And by God's grace, I will deliver on those expectations. So when I saw this topic, I was like, wow, I mean, it sounds very complex, but I will try my best to break it down in the simplest and easiest way possible. And not just break it down, but in a way that you remember key things I would say, and you can actually practically implement these things in either a social enterprise, either an NGO, or even a project that is related to this space sector and even something not even related to this sector. That's how I have decided to structure today's teaching. The topic says building an M&E framework that tracks and showcases the impact of the social enterprise. And I think it's very beautiful that we are looking at monitoring and evaluation this way. We're looking at it from a tracking perspective, and we're also using it to showcase, because in this industry, you can do the work, but if you're not showcasing your impact properly, and that impact is translating to either money, influence, or more impact in itself, then there would be a problem for you as an individual. And it's very common to see, especially grassroots organizations that are actually doing the work and are not getting the right recognition for the value that they are adding and providing. And it could be in the area of monitoring and evaluation. So more than monitoring in itself, there is an evaluation. There is also, the component of actually properly showcasing what you have done, and we would dive right into it. So this is the outline for today's presentation. Just moving this down. We have the introduction. We're going to look at thematic areas. We're going to look briefly at data. We're going to look at storytelling. And of course, we're going to look at presentation. So moving into introduction, monitoring and evaluation basically has to do with two things. And if you ask me, I would say monitoring is basically collecting data, and evaluation is using that data to represent and to translate into meaningful change. So that's the summary of the entire jargon on this slide, right? Monitoring is data. Evaluation is using the data and translating the data into actual influence. So you can get data from different sources and at different points in the work that you do, and we'll look at that moving forward. What evaluation is saying, how do I, derive at a tangible result, and how do I, more than the result, use that result to implement a significant and meaningful change. So here are some purposes of monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring in itself, to learn from experiences. So it could be to learn from a past project, it could be to learn from a past experience, it could be to learn from something that has been done. It's also a framework to have internal and external accountability. So whether a funder, a donor is giving you a template of what they want you to submit to them at the end of the social enterprise, at the end of the project, at the end of the work that is done. It is important that as an organization or as a project lead, you have your own data in-house, because these things, knowledge is so transferable that you can use the data from one project to inform decisions for another project. And sometimes it may not even be the data in itself. So it may just be the structure and the approach, the wisdom with which you handle one project effectively. You transfer that wisdom into saying, I think this will work in this case scenario. So this is definitely one of the great reasons of monitoring. Another one is to take informed decisions. Here we see a lot of advisory groups. We see a lot of youth groups. And the essence of, this intergenerational solidarity, intergenerational movements, is to merge the wisdom of the old and young. I like to say the wisdom of the old with the technology and savviness and energy of young people. So monitoring allows you to do this. Data is the lifeblood of any innovation. Data is the lifeblood of this sector. So you can't be in this sector and be afraid of numbers. I mean, I will still get into that eventually, right? And of course, to promote empowerment for beneficiaries of your initiative. Like I said, in fact, it's very simple. what you don't measure, you can't control. If you want to control something, you have to measure it. You have to monitor it. It's just as simple as this and basic as that. And like I said earlier, most grassroots organizations do the work, but due to lack of proper monitoring, they miss out from these initiatives. They miss out from the bigger flow of money and impacts that they can make and, scale their work. And we see this particularly, you can even say in churches and charities or even Christian charities, which is, I would say, very sad because a lot of people do the work, but they are not able to translate and say, oh, this Christian outreach that we did for 50 widows, how do we translate it in line with key monitoring and evaluation metrics? How do we link it in line with the UN SDGs and tell the story of the lives that we have changed and transformed so that we can get more to scale these impacts while, of course, preaching the gospel or whatever the Christian or church organization is doing. So it's very key and important that you monitor. And like I just gave an example, in monitoring, there may be different ways to tell your stories depending on the nature and the class of your stakeholder. So if a Christian-based charity is doing something like the illustration I just gave, and they want to tell their story to a Christian-based charity, of course, they will tell it that way. If a Christian-based charity is telling their story to maybe a women-led initiative, then they would focus more on the concept, and right, we empowered XYZ women within maybe the age range of this and this with life-saving skills or with financial capital or with literacy skill or with capacity building skill. So monitoring and evaluation is so important. On the other hand, these are some of the things that evaluation helps you to do. It helps you to draw relevance. It helps you to say, these are the areas we should be focusing on, and these are the areas that maybe we should focus on later. It helps you to say, this method has proven effective in leading a project. It helps you to say that this is an efficient way of doing something. I like to say very much that in the kingdom of God, there is order. So there should be order in your life. Even in a shrine, there is order, I think it was last year, I went to a community to do something, and I was trying to do a vlog. I have many unedited vlogs, God help me. And I was working close to a shrine, and one of the industry professionals with me said, oh, Tolu, we're about to pass a shrine, so put your phone down. So it shows that the things you watch on Hollywood, part of them are real. Even the shrine has systems and processes. So your life cannot be disorderly. It's just as simple as that. The same way your projects cannot be disorderly. It's easy for me to sit down and say, I have done this for 7 years, and next year will be my 8th year. It's easy for me to sit down and say, I have done this for 6+ years. It's easy for people to sit down and say, oh, I have made this impact in my work, or we have made this impact in our work in the past decade. Not necessarily because at the beginning they always knew what they were doing, or because they always figured it out initially, but because they were able to create the right systems to monitor, properly evaluate. And in evaluating, they have drawn the right inference to say, these are the numbers, right, that can be tied to the impact that we have made. Of course, evaluation also helps for impact. And finally, it helps for sustainability, or you can say longevity. So going into thematic areas, and I really hope that this particular section helps and meets the need of every social entrepreneur, of every project manager, or everybody that needs it. Like I just mentioned, there is the need for the right systems and structures. So in organizations, we often have times where we have peak projects, peak project seasons. Oh, wow. And we have times. Is it possible to rejoin if it ends, or how do we go about that?
I don't even know how that happened. Anyways, you could go on for another 5 minutes and then we'll rejoin. So just to mention, if we go up in another 5 minutes, we can rejoin back with the same link while I try to work on what's happening back end. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So it's important that you create systems and structures when you're having, I would say, a little bit downtime, or you're having an even pace in your organization or social enterprise. So how do you go about this? You want to start by listing out the work that your organization does. So you look and you see, oh, we have an advocacy project, or we have 3 research projects ongoing, or we have 7 capacity builders projects ongoing, or we have 1 project implementation project ongoing, or we have 2 or 3 policy implementation projects ongoing. You want to list those out, right? Now, when you do that, next thing you want to do is you want to group similar projects under a unifying theme. So for instance, we have 4 research projects going. So research is definitely a big aspect of the work that this organization or social enterprise does. So you list research. Or we have a couple of events to repertoire. You want to list those out. Or for instance, we have one project going, but there may be need to create a project division. You want to list that out. We have policy and policy implementation. We are going into that kind of thing. You want to list that out. Now, the next thing you do is you create a draft template for them. So for instance, for capacity building, you're going to be hosting a lot of events. You're going to need a lot of questionnaires. So you can create a dummy questionnaires and say, under section 1 for demographics, these are some feature questions that we would ask looking at demographics. And then you can say for section 2, these are some project tailored related questions. And for section 3, you can say this is related to maybe the technology that we are using or the mechanism that we are using to transmit this capacity building training to people. And then for section or for another template, you can decide to say this is an attendance draft. And in attendance, we are key on monitoring the age range and age classifications of attendees. We are key on PWID representation. We are key on representation of women in STEM or whatever. You want to have these things because it makes it easier. So when you have to actually implement a project, whether your funder or funding organization or funding partners or implementing partners give you a template to use in implementing your project, you have something in-house that you can just rebrand, just change header and footer and maybe add one tab, right? Maybe transportation stipend. You create a template in-house and it becomes a lot easier. Now, the next part is, of course, training team members. It's important that in this industry, we invest in people. We take a chance on people and we watch them grow. Because there was obviously a time, for instance, me, I didn't know nothing. I didn't even know what I was doing. I didn't know the SDGs existed. I didn't know what the UN was, So there was obviously a time that happened to me too. And doing that makes room for people to grow. So this is basically how to create an in-house template for the work that your social enterprise or for the work that your organization does. It could even be a return on investment, template. It could be a financial template for your annual or monthly returns. It could be a template for anything, but it is key that you're able to group and you're able to follow the right steps in highlighting the key areas and key things that need to be measured. So I'm going to go into data, and in simple primary 6, primary 5, primary 4 computer science definition, data is raw facts. When it's processed, it becomes information, and you can do anything with raw facts. Of course, we are very much familiar with research methodology, and we have things like quantitative and qualitative data. As much as it is great and beautiful to be able to describe the work that you do, having the right figures, putting quantity to it, just gives it a better feel and makes it more authentic. It makes it a lot easier to measure. It doesn't mean that descriptive data cannot be measured. It can, but having numbers always makes it easier. So my advice and recommendation is always to have a measure of the two, either quantitative and qualitative, and not just focus on one area or one aspect of data. Other data, we're looking at 3 main parts. The first one is, of course, data collection. Next is data analytics. And then the third is drawing inference from data. So for data collection, there are 1,000,001 ways that you can go about this. You need to understand that every data is important. Every data is valid. Data analytics, it really just means playing with the data. So if anybody says data analytics to you and it's giving you a headache, remember that when you say you play with the data. And what do I mean by playing with data? It could mean finding sum, which is addition. It could mean subtraction. It could mean average. And very popularly in this sector, it could mean representing in percentages. So for instance, you want to find the difference between your base and midline or your base and end line, and convert that data that you have gotten into percentage in itself. Or you want to find the average of a sum of terms and convert that into percentage in itself. So for instance, we can say that 33 out of the 36 states in Nigeria experience flooding. That's very stressful to say during an interview. If I want to say that, I can go further and say in 2022, about 91% of the states in Nigeria were affected by the 2022 flooding. If I don't want to go as far as the actual, 91 point whatever percentage that's 33 over 36 actually gives me in percentage, I can go ahead and say more than 70% of the states in Nigeria were severely affected by the 2022 flooding. So that, of course, in itself makes me sound like a professional. And that sounds like tangible data that people will want to listen to and will keep people informed during the course of my presentation. So that's basically a summary of what data analytics is and means. It doesn't mean you may not need to create a table. You may need to create a table. You may need to actually do this thing on an Excel spreadsheet, but it's not as complex as we make it seem. It's not as complex as we paint it to be. The next thing is drawing inference from data. Data is useless if it does not give you a result. Data is useless if it does not lead to an action. Data is useless if it does not help you to track a pattern, or recognize something that, oh, there was an increase and at this point there was a decrease, right? For instance, I saw a recent report by, I think it was the International Energy Agency, saying that between 2016 and 2022, the difference in funding that the African countries had received had dropped by about 33%. So it actually put 15 point something billion in 2016 and something point something billion in 2022. I just went to do the maths in my head. So I'm not going to go and start telling somebody in 2016 they received XYZ billion. In 2020 they received. I mean, you can't do that if you're having a money conversation, but it's always good to play with the percentages. So you may need to sit down and say, I need to play all those games that make me do brain maths or math brain, whatever it's called on the Play Store, and just say, I need to refresh on my percentages. I need to refresh on subtraction. I may need to refresh a little on abacus maths. How best can I do this thing? It's like that thing by default in the African market where you give somebody 1,000 naira note and you're buying something of 400 and you don't know if they're going to have change. So you give them 1,100 so that what's it called? You give them maybe 600 to balance your change or whatnot, depending on whether what you're buying is 600 or 400. So it's really just as important as that. When you collect the data, don't just keep it and say, oh, we gave them questionnaires, we gave them surveys, we gave them. No, it's important that you go further to draw inference. And it's also important that your data analytic mechanics are across a group of data are uniform. So for instance, I recently attended the launch of a climate ranking event, and it was basically saying in Nigeria, among the 36 states, which state is, has the most going on for them in terms of climate governance. And they list the metrics and say, oh, if you have this, you get 10 points. If you have this, you have 10 points, and blah, blah, blah. And they said, oh, that's how we did for climate governance. And then we went to say climate literacy, which one has a website, which one has a this, which one has a that. If your state has this, we rank you as this. If your state has this, we have you at this. So it shows consistency in choosing the right metrics. And that is very, very important and key and paramount in understanding and interpreting data. So yes, we're going into storytelling, and I have divided this into 3 parts. So the first is structure, next is data, and next is outcome. When you're presenting results, it's important to structure your presentation, whether it is a story, a written story, whether it is a PowerPoint presentation, or even if it is a video in itself, because in this sector, you don't necessarily say, oh, I'm not a graphic designer. Tomorrow, you may have to just wake up and use CapCut, right? In this sector, you are the everything. Even at the beginning and at the middle, because there will be times you need something and you can't reach designer. So in this sector, you're always the everything. How do you structure your presentations? Divide it into 3 main parts: introduction, body, conclusion. I learned this in university and it is still very much relevant and works very much. So introduction is basically how do you present it? How do you grab your audience attention? In this age where we have over, I would say, 70% of the world's population as Gen Z, or as young people particularly, it's important that you grab the attention of your audience within the first 5 seconds. If you don't grab their attention either by the way you dress or the aura of confidence coming from you, or from the quality of your presentation, or from the right vocabulary and mannerisms, you probably would not grab their attention during the rest of the presentation. So it's important that you grab and hold the attention of your audience at the beginning of the presentation, right? It could be, using an icebreaker. It could be basically just the way you introduce yourself. It could be having a small activity. It could be using a story that is very relatable for them to understand what you're trying to communicate. So introduction, and then the body. In this area, you can choose to focus on key components. You can choose to focus on key aspects of the presentation. Maybe, for instance, the inference, or for instance, the methodology and the inference can be your body in itself, and then conclusion can be the result. Conclusion can, towards the end, lead to a call to action, right? It's always good to end that way so that people go home taking something that they have learned. And if it is an interactive presentation, at every sub of your presentation, or at every introduction, body, and conclusion, you may want to put in a 1-minute activity where you ask the audience to interact with you and say, what have you learned? What stood out for you? In saying those things, people actually remember a lot after presentations and after just learning sessions or stories than you just allow them watch and go home. When you ask people to share, they remember a lot. They do. It's the same way when someone asks you a question. For instance, if you ask me a question and I know the answer is on Google, instead of answering you, I will tell you to check Google. And I'll say it politely. Because when you check Google, you will find more information on that thing and it would stick. You remember that I asked Ori this question. I was angry that she didn't tell me, but I'm happy I went to Google. But if I just give you the answer, you would go with a limited answer. So it's important that, especially in this age, we help people to consciously learn. We help people to consciously become lifelong learners. Next, when we're looking at data, of course, you can break it into 3 areas: your baseline, your midline, your endline. So for instance, if you're looking at a social enterprise model, we can say our baseline is before the project. Who are the target audience? You can decide to start a project and say, oh, we're going to look at 60 people. But midline, when you've actually started, you go back and say, oh, we're actually dealing with 40 people. And this is the reason why we streamlined from 60 to 40. These are the criteria we looked at initially when we said we were going to look at 60 people. And this is what happened. This is why it is 40. And endline, from the 40 that we have actually, brought into this program, 80% were active. We noticed this problem with 70%. Or we noticed that 90% had this feedback to say about this particular mechanism, or about this particular framework, about this particular material. So data, like I always say. Break your data into parts: baseline, midline, endline. Sometimes you may not always conduct midline, depending on the kind of nature of the project. It may just be baseline and endline, but there has to be something, right? There has to be a learning point. There has to be a learning curve. So take, for instance, the Nigeria Youth Future Fund climate education project that I implemented. I learned a lot about budgeting from that project. It was not the first time handling a project, but running us on, I would say, limited resources, limited valuable resources that I appreciate. I plan to teach or to train 40 teachers. And when I was budgeting for the food, I forgot we had volunteers. And it's a mistake a lot we make in, budgeting. We just say, okay, they are giving 5,000 USD. Write the budget to reflect 4,889 USD. Then the remaining money, you just put it as miscellaneous. That's not necessarily the way to write budget, right? It's always good to have an actual budget and give room for 20 or 10% inflation, of the actual budget that you have written as your miscellaneous, and whatever remains from that, you can add it to the miscellaneous and put it down to balance out the numbers, if that is what you want to do. Or if you do that and your budget is still within the 4,000 USD plus and you're getting a 5,000 USD grant, it's still better for you. It is still better. I mean, in the past 3 years, we have seen inflation go from 10 to 20 to 40 to 60, and in some cases even to over 200%. For instance, in January, import duties were increased between 5 to 7 times in just Q1 alone. So what kind of budgeting do you think they did? So we had that issue, right? Because I factored in budgeting for the teachers. I forgot to even budget for my guests. I just said, we are training 40 people, 40, I forgot to budget for my guests. I forgot to budget for the photographers. I'm paying the photographer. She use their money to eat. So there's always the need to learn from these things. This year, the grant applications, the things I have planned, the things I have submitted, I have been a lot more critical with budgeting, I have been a lot more critical, just because I have taken the data from a previous project and I have, like I said, converted that into transferable knowledge and put it into another project, into another area. Yes, we got the volunteers something eventually, we got, the speakers something eventually, but it just made me to say, I need to be more intentional about this, as much as we are having an attendance that says we want 7 PWID people in attendance, we want this, we want that, we want youth in attendance. We ourselves have to be, a lot more intentional about diversity and inclusion, even in monitoring and evaluation, even in the planning process in itself. And of course, I would say the last part is outcome. There's no point going to make a presentation and you're presenting bad things. Recently I attended a workshop, it was a communications workshop, and they said, okay, if you're going to address a target audience, write 10 keywords you're going to use to talk to that demography and use it to form either maybe the opening line, your introduction, or use it to form, the entire flow. So when I'm communicating, I'm thinking, oh, advocate, sustainability, data analytics, monitoring and evaluation, inference, sustainability, impact report, those kind of things. And they said, okay, think of 10 no words. And I spent time on that assignment and I could barely think of no words. But in this day, in this age, it's not the easiest to be a positive person. Your outlook on life also affects your data, your monitoring and evaluation. That's why when you ask somebody a question and you say, what do you like? They will first tell you 20 things they don't like in 1 hour as an introduction to the 100 things that they actually do not like, because they don't have the data of what they like. So it's important that we spend time talking about the results. If you're making a presentation and it is, what's it called, maybe 70 minutes, less than 10 minutes, less than 5 minutes, go to the problem statement and spend the rest giving action points, giving results, drawing inferences. You can use the data of the problem to talk about the results in itself. For instance, I spoke about a problem I faced, but I didn't spend the next 30 minutes telling you the problem. If only I knew, I wouldn't have blamed myself. If only I knew, I should have blamed the project manager that did it physically. If only I knew, I should have blamed the grant organization. Because why didn't they come out? Like, I'm not. If I didn't say this now, you probably won't realize that, okay, wow, she should have blamed all those people and even more people. So focus on the solution, focus on the results. What is the result from the data? What is the percentage gap from your baseline and end line? What is the data showing you? Maybe in your mind, you had a feeling, you had a nudging that this was going to go this way, but the data is saying, so you can say, contrary to what I imagine, contrary to what I believe, this is what the data is actually saying. Does it mean we need to, do the survey again? Does it mean we need to learn from this? Does it mean we need to merge my feelings and my intuition with what data is saying? Or do we want to do 70% data and 30% intuition? Or do we want to do 30% intuition, 70% data? What are your feedbacks? How do you perceive the data, right? One data can be used for 1,000,001 things. I mean, it's just what data mining is. And looking further into solutions, what are the next steps? What are the next steps? What is the data saying? If the data can tell you a problem, the data can tell you a solution. Like I said, the data problem can be used as a solution. The data problem can point you to a solution. It's a data problem does not, or the problem of the data statement, or the data statement problem, whatever the English vocabulary is anyway at the moment. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all about the problem, right? If it shows you people are sick in the country because their blood level is low, the question you should be asking is, what are they eating? And then you do a research and you realize that the cost of food is expensive. So what does that mean? It means people cannot afford protein to eat. So they are falling sick due to low blood level. So your solution is not going to be, how do you make them to stop falling sick? Your solution is going to be grassroots. Your solution is going to be, how do you give them protein? How do you make food affordable? That's basically what the solution is saying, right? And of course, presentation. So when we say presentation, it's actually meant to say recommendation, right? How does the data in itself lead you to the next steps? How does the data provide the next recommendation to you and for you? So I'm going to run through presentation very quickly because I did not want to bombard us with graphs and numbers. I decided to make the graphs in this slide as minimal as possible, while of course delivering the right knowledge. On that presentation, I have broken it into two: visuals and communication. For communication, it is important to be clear as much as possible. Life, I like to say to people, life is complex a lot. Life is already complex. There's no glory in making it to be more mysteriously complex. Like I gave the illustration of what I like and what I don't like. Life is complex a lot. People are going through a lot already. If you want to communicate it, make it clear. I don't remember the culture. I think it's a European-based culture. When they ask you for the price of something as an artisan, whatever price you tell them is what they pay. They are not going to start bargaining. They're not going to tell you increase, decrease. Like, they don't like stress. So in your communication, make it as clear, as concise as possible. And if you're looking, to explore more on communication, you can just learn more from the 7 C's of communication. The 7 C's of communication. In your communication, when you're communicating your results, it is important, if it is a spoken communication, to project your voice. So I learned this from my dad and I still implement it. He says, speak twice the audience. So if you go into the room and your eyes count 20 people, assume you're talking to 40 people. That way your voice will become loud. All this, my voice is small. My voice is not small. Don't talk, and the person that is supposed to hear, to hear and invest in your project and your idea would not hear it because your voice is small. Me too, my voice is small. My voice is very small. So it's important that you project your voice. And of course, in oral communication, avoid slangs. Avoid slangs. I know it's an, in fact, I attended a consultation and I was irritated and I left. For every 2 seconds, the moderator was Gen Z, Gen Z. And in my head, I'm like, is it a mental disorder? Is it a personality? Like, it's not a personality type. It's not. It's not. It's not. Imagine I'm in this presentation, I'm like, so you know that these things from the data, these things. By the time I say it, if you stay 10 times, if you stay up to, to hear 10 times, you would log out. You tell, it's like, Adekemi, please, wherever you don't bring that lady again. If I don't even invite her to anything speaking that in your life until she stops it. And like, have you listened to someone speak at an event and then they come up and you're like, and then just and you're like, and you're just looking like, open your mouth and talk, and they keep and this thing in Africa, we celebrate inferiority, which is bad. So you think it's an American thing. You think if I say it, it means I'm more learned. So me that have been speaking fluently for the past few minutes, do I sound less learned to you? Do I? So it's important that, please, what is proper is proper. Professionalism is a professionalism, right? Whether you're a Gen Z, you're a Gen Alpha, you're whatever before the Gen Z, you are the one after. We really don't care. There have been many people on the planet and there will be many more. You're not the first and the last. Please communicate clearly and properly so that people can get the best out of what you want to say. Of course, there is also the part of, I would say, visual communication, but I will go into that in the next slide. So for visuals, not too wordy, like my slide. If someone picks this someone that was on this call picks this presentation slide, they'll say, wow, the presentation was so good. But if someone that was not in this presentation picked my slide, it would make little or no sense to them. Because the value is not just in the design, the value is not just in the slide, the value is in what the speaker has to say. There's no point coming to your presentation and reading everything. You could have just sent us a report to read at home. It's that simple. If we wanted to read reports, we won't have asked you to come. We can read English or whatever the report is in. So please, slides should not be too wordy. Slides should be easy to understand. Slides should use data as much as possible. You know what case studies do for people? Case studies stress you. And I would always say, if you get a case study and there's a table, convert it into a graph. It can mean a line graph. It can mean, people like line graph because line graphs, let me go to a slide. This is a line graph. Line graphs make things very complex. And if there's a key point I want to highlight, for instance, here, I can just circle this or put a cursor or put a pin here and know that this is a key point. So when I'm speaking to the person, I'm telling them that for item 3, we had a 40-something.8 something. The person doesn't know what I'm saying, but of course I sound eloquent and I sound like the professional that I am because I have done the work and I'm speaking fluently to the data that is available. So it can be bars, it can be lines, different kind of line graphs. I mean, that's basically what the industry uses these days anyway, right? It could even be percentages. It could, but the data has to say something. If I look at this pink, I'm seeing key points. I'm seeing here item 1 as a key point. I'm seeing here as a key point. I'm seeing here as a key point. So these 3 points are telling me something very significant and important. For blue, almost everything in blue is telling me something, but the loudest data point in this blue line is this peak at 50 and back here at 20. So I want to find out, oh, what happened here? What happened here? That's basically what data does for you. So these things are important. And like I said, data is not difficult. It's just really about playing with it. When you hear data analytics, it just means play with the numbers. So if you're giving a data in tabular form, convert it to a graph. If you're giving it in a graphical form, convert it into not necessarily a tabular form, but understand it. Whatever form of data you are giving at the beginning or you get at the beginning of your data collection or data survey, it should not be the same form that it's presented. That's the most important thing. That's the summary. That's the cocoa. Don't present raw data as data. Present raw data as information. Convert it into something, right? So use the right graphs. Use the right colors. It could be a pie chart. It could be a pie chart in percentages. It could be a pie chart in maybe just over 360. It could be anything. It could be, something showing market share analysis. It could be something showing target audience response. It could be, I mean, it's beautiful. If this is not important, what's the name of that thing? Google Form would not have taken the extra time to put those graphical responses for you. At some point you see circles, at some point you see bars. It could even be a histogram. It could be anything, but just please play with the data. So yes, back to our visuals. It should be very much easy to understand, just like this one. And you know why this slide is very, very easy to understand? It's because it uses the SDG colors, which a lot of us are familiar with. So it's not just, oh, I decided to pick orange, pink, blue. They represent, different SDGs. So you can decide to, at some point, look for a specific template and tailor it into what you want and say, this is what I want to present. These are my key points. Okay, I like this. I don't like this one. Remove, 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 remove. And that's basically how you work on your slides. You could even also play with the transition. There's a transition effect I like to do, but because of what data did to me this evening, I could not implement that transition effect to keep people, glued to what you're saying. And last but not least, slides should stand alone. So for instance, here I'm talking about visuals, and I have all the points pointing to visuals. If you look at the previous slide, I was talking about communication, and everything about this slide points to communication. So if I want to do this, I should not have communication. I can have communication and visuals, but I should not have two visuals here and have one visual at the back. Do you understand what I'm saying? When someone looks at one slide, you should be able to understand what you are saying. It's the same thing with visual storytelling, CapCut or whatever you're doing. When people look at an area of the story, the introduction, the body, the conclusion, it should make a lot of sense because it is standing alone as an individual element, right? It does not need to have too many information. It does not have to be color riot. I mean, you can play with colors, but the more you play with design, the better you get at it. The more you play with speaking, the better you get at it. The more you play with storytelling and communication, the better you get at it. So thank you very much for having me. I have been talking for a while, and now I would hand over to Kemi and to the rest of the team to speak if you have feedbacks, questions. And please, I'm happy to connect, and I will connect. Okay.